Welcome to the Common Creative Podcast. My name is Paul Fairweather, and my co-host Chris Meredith and I are on a mission to lift the lid on the conversation about creativity in life and business through the lens of ideas, stories, and visual communication. Today, my guest, in the absence of Chris, is Mark Jones. Mark is an architect that I met in 1977 when we started studying architecture together, and Mark has retired a few years ago from both practice and academia, and Mark has recently published a book called Success in Architectural Practice. Now, this is a very niche subject. However, his tagline caught my eye, and it's really about, the tagline is excellence, happiness and profit. And I thought this is really interesting because this is something that we all need and I think all strive for in our lives, around doing good work, making profit, making some money, but also being happy. So I thought I'd take the opportunity. Unfortunately, Chris Meredith, my erstwhile Straight Man podcast co-host, fellow raconteur, is indisposed, and so I have interviewed Mark by myself. So let's hear what Mark has to say about excellence, happiness and profit. Mark Jones, welcome to the Common Creative Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Mark, before we get into today's discussion, can you give us a quick 30 to 60 second potted history about how you came to be where you are?
Okay. Well, look, I'm a retired architect, and I went through the course with one Paul Fairweather. We started together in 1977, and I'd always wanted to be an architect. My dad was an architect, and got through the course, struggled through the course, I should say, like all of us, and I worked for some very good, inspiring architects across 10 years before starting my own practice, which struggled for a while, but it ended up going okay. And then a larger practice called Architectus bought me out, and I was director of that firm for 8 years, retired in 2015, headed overseas for a bit of study and came back and spent some time as an academic, retiring at the end of 2024.
Fantastic. So you're no longer an academic?
I've got an honorary position at UQ School of Architecture, and that just means that I can still do work for them but not get paid for it.
Oh, right. A win-win. No, win-lose. Hey, reason, as you say, we've known each other now for close to 50 years. I also always wanted to be an architect, but then I spent most of my career trying to get out of being an architect.
Yes.
You've written a book, and congratulations on your book. It really presents success in architectural practice. Now, whilst that book is very niche and it's very directed to architectural practices, and we can talk a little bit about it, the tagline of your book is excellence, happiness and profit. And it occurs to me that that tagline applies not just to architectural businesses, in fact, not just to any business, it certainly applies to businesses and to our own lives. You know, it's that balance of, doing good work, getting paid well for it, or at least making a good profit out of it, and being happy. So I'm really interested to unpack some of the learnings that you've had from writing this book, and how it applies to architects, but more importantly, I suppose, for our listeners, those that aren't architects or want to be architects, what are the learnings that you've had from this project?
Yeah, it's an interesting insight, Paul. So probably two observations that I'd like to make falling out of that. I went into the book expecting it to be about basically a pep talk to architects saying, come on guys, let's all do really the best work that we can and make a decent profit out of it. I interviewed 40 eminent architects for the book, and what kept coming out of the interviews was this happiness dimension, which I found really intriguing, but just coming at me. And it's a good point you make, because if you think a cafe owner, a barista, if they don't make a good coffee, you won't go back. But it's that sort of joy of your relationship with your local barista that's a two-way sort of positive, happy interaction that's really important to both parties. And of course, hopefully they're making a profit and staying in business. So yeah, you're right. I hadn't really extended my thinking to that level, but that's probably true of your lawnmower guy or anyone when you think about it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? And I never thought about the barista, but certainly if the barista's unhappy, that can be almost as off-putting as a bad coffee.
Well, I think if they're not happy, they're probably not going to make a good coffee. I mean, there's less chance they'll make a good coffee.
Well,
same with an
You go to a
architect.
coffee shop where the owner's not very happy, but he makes a great coffee. It's got a great.
Okay.
We keep going back, but we love to hate him. It's like an episode out of.
Okay, that's intriguing.
Now, Mark, I went to your book launch a couple of weeks ago, the informal book launch, and you made a comment on there that you did these interviews and you had these set questions. You're obviously a very good researcher, interviewer. Don't mark me down. But what I was intrigued with, you said that you expected, and there's a sort of thinking that after so many interviews, it sort of becomes pretty normal and you're getting the same sort of results, same sort of answers. But you found that wasn't the case in this situation, that you've always finding people have a different take on that. We'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's a concept in research called data saturation where you get to a point after so many interviews or so many surveys where there's really no point going any further because you're just not finding new information. You're not getting new data. And I had done a PhD before this book, and that certainly happened with my interviews for the PhD. With my interviews for architects, and I thought I might do 15 or 20, but new stuff just kept coming out of every interview, so I extended it to 40. And I think I could keep going, but it turns out, there's 8 billion personalities in the world. I think there's 20,000 architects in Australia. But every practice I deduce is a reflection of the personality of the proprietor or the multiple directors of a large practice. So it means that every practice is operating reasonably differently from everyone else. There's common principles, but the mood in the practice and the way they operate, differs much more than I expected.
That's very interesting. When I was coaching non-architectural businesses, I found there was a commonality in their problems.
Sure. Yeah.
And everyone thought their problems were special, but in reality, there's a commonality, and it's all about getting good staff, retaining good staff, difficult clients, all those sorts of things. Did you find that same thing in terms of the problems, or were there some commonalities there underlying?
Yeah, look, I think the architects and probably definitely other businesses, but architects compete in two marketplaces. One, you're competing for the best clients and the best projects, and the other marketplace is you're competing for the best staff. So you really need to be attractive in both of those markets, and that is the sort of fundamental common problem across all practices, I guess. Right. But how people respond to those challenges is quite different. There's a lot of really great emphasis on staff well-being in a lot of leading practices, which was very heartening. And that's, that aspiration to become an employer of choice, it doesn't come down to pay levels. There's all sorts of other nuances of the director-staff member relationship that becomes really important to staff members and very important to staff retention.
I wanted to take a little side shift. This is the Common Creative, and Chris and I are on a mission to lift the lid about creativity in life business through the lens of ideas, stories, and visual communication. Obviously, architecture fits very much in there as a case study. Ideas, stories, and visual communication. One of the things that we found is that we still find a lot of people, in business that don't believe they are creative, and also people think that quite often things like architecture are a lot more creative than they are, because the reality is, it's certainly creative. And there's two parts of this question, but the first part is there's a lot of mundane stuff in in architecture. But do you think that, the creative mindset sort of helps that over and above what might be in a normal business? Because we're inherently creative, although, a lot of times people might not think they are when they're drawing straight lines on the computer.
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because there is a common belief that it's sort of 2%, 5% maybe creativity and architecture, and the rest is just pretty hard grind. But I just wonder if a better attitude might be that it's all creative. You're making decisions constantly, and I'm sure it applies to medicine or law or plastering or anything. You're constantly making decisions. Each decision could be regarded as a creative act. In the case of architects, if you're doing, if you're scheduling all the doors or working out gutter details or whatever, It's all pretty detailed decision making. So it's not something that at this stage anyway that can be done by an artificial intelligence, is it? So there is that creative spark happening constantly, you could argue. It's just what's our attitude to those decision-making processes.
Actually, it's interesting. You talk about, the medicine and other things. There's always the great saying that, like the plumber's sink and the panel beater's car and the doctor's health. I have found that, in the architects that I coach, that, it needs to be a sort of a bit of a paradigm shift of their thinking for them to go, okay, I can use my design skills in designing the practice, because otherwise they just end up, focusing on the design outcomes and not thinking about, the practice. Have you found that sort of approach has changed, that there are more practices sort of realising that they can apply their own design and creativity skills to their own practice?
Well, I think that's a very important point, because I don't think there's a big intellectual difference between designing a building and designing a practice. So there's all sorts of options you've got in designing a practice in terms of premises, staffing, technology, things as mundane as insurances or financial management or whatever. But you really want to design a practice in the same sense that you design a building to be very efficient, very functional, very pleasing. So I don't think that's a new thing, but there are some writings out there about younger architects possibly being more creative in how they're approaching architectural practice and setting up different sorts of relationships with clients and prospective clients, and actually being possibly a little more humble in their self-perception of how they fit into the building industry, and actually reaping some good benefits from these sorts of slightly different attitudes, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, look, I really like that, to hear that. I'm pleased to hear that, because, as past architectural director of awards, I have bumped up against numerous, at the time, young bucks.
Yep.
With enormous egos.
Yep, sure.
Who were not only thought they should be judge and jury, but also, enter judge and jury. I suppose the point I was making, and it's really about this thinking about a paradigm shift. Because, I had a lifetime friend who was a very well-known doctor who lived the last 10 years of his life in Ireland, and he died of prostate cancer, probably totally preventable, his death. And I have another friend who, has had his out, but but it's escaped. So it's a classic thing of, and here are, doctors, they're so focused on other people's health that they don't think of their own. And so it's really, I think, in just terms of, the listeners, it's really having a look at, businesses, what are their core skill sets and how can they apply that to their own lives and own businesses? Because I think so often, people don't, as I said, the plumber's sink and the, the architect's house,
Yep.
So I'm really interested. So I think that, is a thing. Now, Mark, you mentioned there, you started thinking about, like almost touching on your design philosophy. And quite a few years ago, you gave me the design philosophy that you or the architects had sort of developed, which I talked about in my book. And I don't know if I've actually accredited you in that. So my apologies. My book's more brave and a bit quirky. Also published by End Also Books, which is your publisher. But I did an article some time ago, which I think I did mention you in it. But it was this thing that, and again, it's this idea that you had around design practice, but I think it was so transferable to life and business, which was really, and I'll just give the outline, but you can maybe flesh it out. It was very simple, was have a design problem is to make it as simple as possible and then make it as elegant as the budget allows. Now, I thought that was absolutely brilliant. So do you want to sort of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, it's probably generated in my sort of working career from working for some, very eminent architects, Lindsay Clare, and John Hawkins was very good at communicating this concept where an architect's presented with a site and a client brief, and it's a matter of approaching the fusion of those by looking for the big moves. So it's basically setting up some very simple diagrams of what's happening on that site around all the usual influences of views and climate and topography and adjacent uses and so on. So You bring all that together with the client's requirements and set up the simplest diagram across the site that you can. And then that's explained to the client. And usually when you present these very simple diagrams to the client, they think, oh, wow, there can't be any other solution. This is the simplest and best way to approach it. Becomes quite obvious to all parties to the event. And then having established that, it's a matter of continually overlaying the client requirements to bring out that elegance, I guess. So it's sort of a humane simplicity, and you add the magic as you go along. But if you don't start with the simple diagram, you can really get into sort of a convoluted mess, and it's hard to have a sort of unifying theme. That's the basic thinking.
Yeah, look, I really like it, and I think it's really applicable, to lots of areas in business and life, and particularly with AI, because, AI can give us endless iterations. And if we don't have that simple idea to start with, we can lose track, and AI, I think, can make it, even more complex. In my article I wrote, I likened it to, the shaker movement, where their basic principle was that, if it's not going to be beautiful and functional, don't make it.
Sure.
And I thought a lot about, since we had that discussion and you explained that to me before, and I think that people, when they say that, the budget allows, that budget being financial, but there's obviously, there's a series of aspects which again also apply to general businesses. It is the budget, it's the manpower, it's the program, the time frame, the quality of the resources that you're dealing with, the approval processes. There's so many things. But again, it comes back to the thing, if you have that simple defining idea, then it allows, at least in the end, even if because of the budgets, it's stripped right back, you still have something that is at least simple and elegant in its own simplicity.
Yeah. Look, I think what architects are very good at is giving the client the very best option for where to sort of smash out the happiness element in the building design. So just a little touch that doesn't cost much, as in it's a little bit of additional space or an applied expensive material, for instance. That little splash of happiness can make a very big difference to, all the occupants of the building or space or place, sense of enjoyment of that. And they're probably, speaking to you here and now, Paul, it occurs to me that there probably is cross-application into life. We've all got ourselves into a particularly complex personal mess at times, and you spend quite a bit of time sort of simplifying your life, coming back to it. But there's still, even if you're a bit challenged financially, there's still opportunity for special little splashes of happiness, isn't there?
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting, and I've been listening recently to a conversation, a podcast. I'll find the details. We put in the show notes as well, with Alan Bottain, and talking about, the house. And he wrote that book about, architecture and happiness. But it was very interesting, talking about, the importance of place and, coming from someone who wasn't a designer and his aspects. So I think it is a thing. And I hadn't really thought about it when we started this interview, about the opportunities for architects to, bring an element of happiness. Obviously, they all be happy if it was under budget, but often that's making more and more difficult these days.
Yeah, indeed.
Mark, on our a fairly recent episode of the podcast, where a fellow called Jake Tahuna, who's a young American fellow, and he gave us a definition of creativity that he developed before he started a business, and he needed a definition of creativity. And I just wanted to share it with you and think how it applies to architecture. I've been trying to flog up creativity to businesses for many years, since I hung up my shingle, or put my shingle away, actually. Hung up when you started, isn't it? And he said that creativity is simply identifying an opportunity and then fostering its development. And I love this, because I think that it's all encompassing. It certainly applies to art. But this idea, I'm going to, carry it through and create a painting or a sculpture or a piece of music, what it might be. But I think it's very important for architecture to see that. Often identifying the opportunity can be difficult, because quite often our ideas of the opportunity can be invariant to the clients and or the approval authorities and various things. So do you want to just have a little comment about the process in architecture of that definition of creativity?
Look, just come at that question slightly differently and just pull me back in line after my first comment, and that I never considered myself a particularly strong architect, but I have actually been quite good at having an awareness of opportunities and sort of grabbing it and running with it. So in those terms, I quite like that definition of creativity because it makes me feel better about my own narrow skills. So yeah, I saw an opportunity to set up my business, for example, and then I saw an opportunity to get into a particular sector, and having identified an opportunity, just to take that last example, I wanted to do public architecture, and going back 30 years you needed a certified quality management system, for example, so it worked very hard to pull all that together, but it did set up all sorts of opportunities for great work. And then the opportunity to write a book, I realised I had a body of knowledge that was potentially the basis of a book. So yeah, it is a nice definition. It's different. I don't know if a fine artist would appreciate that definition or not. But for I guess I have been an entrepreneur in a way. And for an entrepreneur, it's quite a nice definition.
Yeah. Look, I think for a fine artist it is, because I think the reality is that, a lot of artists, struggle with the blank canvas. And I know myself, and in my book, I talk about a quote Robert Boyd used to help him, motivate him every day he went to the canvas, which came from Shakespeare, which was "Nothing will come of nothing." So it's fine to have all the ideas, but unless and I think some things can just be ideas. But if you want to be a fine artist, you got to get out of your hand and onto the canvas.
Yeah.
But I have another definition of an artist, actually, which again I think is also applicable to architecture and to many businesses, and very much to leadership. I did share it at the launch of the Architect's Art, where I was MC, and it comes from a book called How to Live an Artful Life, and it comes from a guy, Nick Willings, and it was actually his mother, his parents, that told him this when he was a kid, and her name was Paula Rego, who was a fairly famous American artist. Basically, that the definition of an artist is a person that goes to a place that we have never been, and brings back something that we've never seen, but that we instantly recognize.
Yeah.
And I think that is, what an architect does, or what a good architect does, because it really is, people go to an architect because, they don't have those skills they need to take their idea or their vision to a building. But when they see the final thing, it's yes, but, I've never seen it before. So do you want to just have a bit of a chat about that?
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Because you look at any invention like a safety pin or whatever, and you can't imagine it not having been there, but someone did think of it. The classic example is wheels on suitcases, of course.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, something that just makes sense when you see it. And that's certainly the case with paintings and sculptures and pieces of music. You can't imagine there not being the song Yesterday, or there not being Blue Poles or any other famous painting. So, yeah, they just become a part of the psyche very comfortably. I suppose that's the thing.
But I think it's also in architecture, when you walk into that space, that you've never been into, and it's, I suppose, I think a few months ago I went to Museum of Old and New Art, in Hobart, and I've never been there, and it was just mind-blowing. But again, it's, I instantly recognise, because, part of the experience is like being in a cave, and so all of a sudden, I've been in caves before, so I recognise this, so I think it's just that juxtaposition of a way that as architects, that in our mind, or in our research or in our experience, we've been somewhere else where clients have never been. Able to, in most cases, in some cases, the clients don't get it.
Yeah, sure.
But in most cases, they, oh my God,
Yeah. No, it's very true. I mean, you walk into, I remember walking into Lang Park when it was refurbished and tearing up, you can, or Sydney Opera House.
Well, yeah, look, exactly.
Goma in Brisbane, these spaces are just so exciting.
But recognisable, and there's something, brings that thing about that, that happiness, and it makes us feel better.
Sure.
Mark, unfortunately, we're coming to a close. Of our, as always, gone very quickly.
Yeah.
I do, at the end, ask our guests to give one bit of insight or a bit of advice to our listeners. Now, for you, it could be anything. It could be, about writing a book, or or, a learning from your book about, that might help people in their business or their lives?
There's an interesting theory that I came across in writing the book, which goes something like this, and it talks to your point about the overconfident young architects you dealt with. There's a phenomenon with young staff members having a very high opinion of their own ability, which needs a bit of clever management, but fairly quickly, as a young architect, and I'm sure in any trade or profession, you realise, holy heck, I don't know much at all. I've got so much to learn. How am I ever going to learn all this? And there's years of hard work, tough learning, till you get to a point where you're basically a guru. And in my case, I didn't, even at the end of my working life as an architect, I really thought I didn't quite understand what I was doing, But then I came to start teaching, and in fact, probably for any 50-something, 60-something-year-old professional, you know a hell of a lot that you don't even know you know. Mm-hmm. That's just this immense body of wisdom inside you, which is actually quite gratifying if you do get the opportunity to teach or mentor as you are, Paul. So that's been a big insight through my working life. I do remember being overconfident as a 24-year-old, I guess, and then by 30 realising, holy heck, how am I ever going to master this? And of course I never did, but you do get to a point eventually where you do have some wisdom.
Mark, well, that's a great insight, and there has been some research, which I'll tell you about later, around that, which I talked about on the show before.
Okay.
But Mark, look, thank you for your time. Congratulations again. Success in architectural practice, excellence, happiness and profit. Maybe the precursor to the follow-up, success in life and business, excellence, happiness and profit, and published by our good friends Matthew and also books. So we'll put in the show notes links to where they can get the book. Thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic to reconnect with you, and congratulations again.
Yep, thanks, Paul, and thanks for opening up some new ideas.
Well, I trust you enjoyed that if you weren't an architect or aren't an architect anymore or never been an architect. I think there really is some transferable lessons there from this study of architecture about happiness, excellence and profit that you might be able to apply in your life and your business. So if you have enjoyed this and found it interesting or useful, please leave a 5-star rating, not for myself, of course, but for Mark. But the most important thing, if you could follow and tell your friends, because it's through our listenership that we can spread the word about the Common Creative. So that's it for me for this week. And please join us next week where Chris will be back for another exciting episode of the Common Creative Podcast.